There is a certain kind of loneliness that only appears when you are surrounded by the people who love you most. Not the loneliness of being alone, not the clean, manageable ache of missing someone. Something more specific than that, something quieter and harder to name. It arrives at dinner tables, during holidays, in the middle of conversations that are warm and familiar and full of real laughter, and still leave you driving home with a weight in your chest that you cannot explain to anyone. Because how do you explain that you felt lonely in a room full of the people who raised you? How do you say out loud, I love them completely, and I am not entirely reachable by them anymore? And the hardest part, the part that makes this particular loneliness so difficult to carry, is that there is no villain in the story. No one was unkind, no one failed. The people at that table love you genuinely and wholly, and you love them back with the same completeness. But something shifted somewhere in the slow and irreversible work of a life genuinely lived. And now the person they reach for when they say your name, the version they hold with such certainty, that person has not quite existed for years. If you know that feeling, that precise, nameless ache of sitting at a table full of your own people and sensing the gap, then you are not alone in this. And you are not broken for feeling it. Before we go any further, share in the comments where you're watching from, and whether this is something you've been carrying in silence. Because I think more people are living inside this particular grief than anyone admits out loud. And stay with me until the end, because what I'm going to share in the second half of this completely changes how you understand the distance and the love that survived it. Let me tell you about Nadia. Nadia grew up in a family that was, by most measures, a good one. There was loyalty, fierce, unquestioned, the kind that shows up without being asked. There was humor and shared history and the particular warmth of people who have known each other long enough to communicate in shorthand. Her parents had worked hard. They were proud people who had built what they had from very little and who held with understandable conviction the values that had carried them through. But Nadia read, widely, hungrily, from a young age. She asked questions her family did not always have the patience for. She felt things at angles the household did not naturally accommodate. Not because her family was unkind, but because they operated in the language of practicality, and she had been born, inconveniently, in the language of depth. She was 17 when she first felt it. She had come home burning with an idea, something she had read, some angle on the world that had rearranged something inside her, and she sat down at dinner and tried with too much eagerness to share it. She watched the table's response, not hostile, not dismissive exactly, more like the way a room responds to music that is not quite the right genre for the occasion. A polite waiting for it to finish. A gentle steering back toward familiar ground. She understood the message, not the one they intended. They had intended no harm, but the one that arrived underneath the response regardless. This part of you does not quite fit the room. So Nadia learned to leave that part of herself elsewhere. She went to university. She found for the first time conversations that wanted to go somewhere new. Ideas that pressed back and made her think further and differently than she had known was possible. She changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but thoroughly. The way a river changes a landscape, quietly and without pause, until the terrain no longer resembles what it was. She came home for holidays. She sat at the table. She loved her family with the same completeness she always had. But she could no longer pretend the gap was not there. And what followed, the years of managing the distance, of translating herself for the room, of feeling seen as a younger version of herself, while the actual version stood slightly to the side. That was the part no one had warned her about. She had been told what growth costs in effort and discipline. No one had told her what it costs in belonging. Nadia's story is not just hers, it is the story of millions of people who grew in a direction their family of origin could not follow, and are now living quietly with the grief that creates. Psychologists have studied this for decades. Carl Jung called it individuation, the long, non-linear process through which a person separates their identity from the system that formed them, develops values that are genuinely their own, rather than inherited ones worn without examination, builds a self that can exist independently of the roles and narratives that were assigned before they were old enough to choose. But the framework that names this most precisely comes from psychiatrist Murray Bowen, who spent his life studying how family systems shape individual psychology. Bowen called it differentiation of self. The higher your level of differentiation, he found, the more capable you are of maintaining a distinct identity inside relationships, of thinking clearly and independently without being pulled back into the emotional current of the original family system. And here is what his research showed that almost no one talks about. People with higher differentiation, the ones who grew beyond the family's emotional and intellectual orbit, did not love their families less. They simply developed the capacity to be present with them without losing themselves in the process, to hold genuine closeness without fusion, to show up at the table without quietly disappearing into the version of themselves the table needed them to be. That is not coldness. That is not ingratitude. That is not the symptom of a broken family. That is what happens when a person grows authentically past the edges of the system that formed them. And the loneliness it produces, the specific loneliness of loving people you can no longer be fully met by. That is not a character flaw. It is not ingratitude dressed up in philosophical language. It is a real grief, with real roots, that deserves to be felt clearly, not managed quietly in the car on the way home. But here is the part most people who carry this grief never get told. The part that the family cannot offer them, because the family cannot see it from where they stand. And the part that the wider world rarely gives them either, because the wider world tends to frame this as a success story. You grew, you exceeded your origins, you should feel proud, without acknowledging the cost. Here is the hidden paradox buried inside this particular distance. Hold that. We're going there next, and when you see it clearly, it will change not just how you understand the gap, but how you understand the love that survived it. Here is the paradox. The person who outgrows their family does not love them less. They love them with a complexity that most people never develop, because they have had to. Think about it. It is easy to love people who understand you, who reflect your values, your language, your way of moving through the world. That love costs very little. It runs along a smooth and familiar current, and it asks almost nothing of you because the closeness is effortless and the connection requires no translation, but to love people across a genuine gap, to return again and again to a table where you are not fully seen, to show up for people who hold a version of you that stopped being accurate years ago, and to do it with real tenderness, not performance. That is something else entirely. That is a love that chose to stay after the easy reasons to stay were gone. And here is the other side of it, the side that is even harder to see. The very growth that created the distance, the reading and thinking and becoming that quietly moved a person beyond their family system, was seeded inside that family. The curiosity was encouraged somewhere. The hunger for more was modeled, however imperfectly, by people who worked hard and pushed for something better than what they had. The values that drove the becoming were built on a foundation the family laid. Even when the family cannot recognize its own architecture in what was constructed on top of it, the person who outgrew their family was grown by them first, and the distance, the painful, unasked for, quietly grieved distance, is not the opposite of that gift. It is the proof of it. They were given enough to become more than the room could hold. Now here is where it gets even more important, and it is the part that changes what you actually do with this. Because understanding the paradox is one thing, knowing it intellectually is one thing. But there is a second layer underneath it, one that lives not in the mind but in the nervous system. And until you address that layer, the gap stays a wound rather than simply a shape. Neuroscience has shown us something that makes the loneliness of outgrowing your family make complete sense on a biological level. The human brain is wired, deeply evolutionarily wired, for belonging. Researchers at UCLA found that social exclusion and rejection activate the same neural pathways as physical pain. The brain does not distinguish between being physically hurt and being emotionally disconnected from the people it has relied on for safety. What this means for the person who outgrew their family is this. Every time you sit at that table and feel the gap, every time the conversation circles back to the same place, every time the version of you they reach for is not quite the one standing there, your nervous system registers it as a real signal, not a catastrophic one, but real. A quiet, biological reminder that something that once provided safety no longer quite fits. And that signal, felt again and again over years, creates a kind of cumulative fatigue. An exhaustion that does not come from anything dramatic. That simply comes from the steady work of being in a room where you are loved but not fully seen, and holding both of those things at once. This is not weakness. This is your nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do. And here is where the research gives us something genuinely hopeful. The brain is not fixed. The patterns that formed inside the original family system, the reflexes, the self-editing, the habitual shrinking into the expected version, these are not permanent. Neuroplasticity, the brain's lifelong capacity to rewire through new experience, means that the identity you carry into that room is not the only available identity. New experiences of being fully seen, in friendships, in relationships, in communities you have chosen, build new neural pathways alongside the old ones. They do not erase the family's influence, but they create alternatives, internal references for what it feels like to be known without translation. And over time, those references grow strong enough that the gap, while still real, no longer carries the same capacity to destabilize. You stop needing the room to change, because you are no longer entirely dependent on the room to confirm your existence. But before any of that can happen, and this is the part that cannot be skipped, there is grief that needs to be felt properly. Real grief. Not the managed kind. Not the quiet variety that rides home with you in the car and gets talked over with busyness before it can land. Real grief for what is actually lost in this particular growing. For the version of belonging that once felt simple before the growth made it complicated. For the fantasy, held longer than most people admit, that one day the family would see the full version of you and make the room bigger. That the conversation would finally go somewhere new. That the gap would close. It will not close. not in the way you imagined. That is worth grieving. The closeness you had before you became more than the room could hold. That deserves mourning. Because it was real, because it was home once, because the loss of it was not anyone's failure and not anyone's choice and still happened anyway. And the grief, when it is finally allowed to be what it is, does something the management never could. It releases the pressure, the quiet, chronic pressure of waiting for recognition that is not coming, of returning to the table hoping, somewhere underneath the hope you have learned not to admit, that this time will be different. When the grief is real, the hoping can stop. Not the love, the hoping. And in the space where the hope was, the impossible hope that the gap would simply disappear, something more spacious becomes possible. A way of sitting at the table that is neither the performance of perfect closeness nor the cold management of necessary distance, something truer than both. A love that holds the family as they are, not as you wish they were. That shows up for the parts of them that are genuinely available. The loyalty, the humor, the shared history, the particular warmth of people who knew you before you knew yourself, without bleeding quietly over the parts that will never quite reach you. The gap does not have to heal to stop being a wound. It can simply become the shape of this particular love, honest, unresolved, real. If you are the person this video describes, the one who goes home for the holidays and sits at the table and loves the people there and still feels, quietly and without remedy, the distance, then hear this. You are not broken for feeling the gap. You are not disloyal for having grown past it. And you are not alone in the particular loneliness of loving people across a distance that no one outside of it can quite see. You are allowed to love them without performing closeness you do not feel. You are allowed to grieve what was lost without betraying what remains. You are allowed to go home and participate in the conversation that is possible, without mourning every hour of the evening for the conversation that is not. You are allowed to hold the gap with gentleness rather than guilt, because the distance between who they are and who you have become is not a measure of disloyalty. It is a measure of distance, of actual interior distance, the kind that accumulates in a person who keeps walking forward, even when it costs something. You walked forward, through rooms that were too small, and conversations that moved too shallowly, and years of translating yourself into a language that was never quite your native one. You walked forward, and you became something real. That is not a betrayal of where you came from. It is the finest thing you could have done with it. The family that could not follow you still gave you the ground to stand on. And maybe, in certain quiet moments at the table, in the middle of a conversation that moves in its familiar circle, you might find something unexpected inside that truth. A softness, a recognition that they did what they could, that the room they built was the room they had, that you grew past it not because they failed, but because they gave you just enough, just barely enough, to fly. And that is not nothing. That is everything.